everybody. Welcome to the History Things podcast, Instagram video exclusive continued coverage of the Maryland Campaign 1862. I'm your host, Pat McGuire. Joining me today is my co-host, Matt Borders. How you doing, big guy?
Always great to be in the field, Pat.
Yeah, we love being back in the field. So last time we joined you from the field, we were at Monocacy National Battlefield. We were on the Best Farm, site of the 1864 fight, but we were there exploring some 1862 ongoings, which at the time were the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia kind of bivouacking in the area, all over the Best Farm property, things like that. In fact, Lee and Longstreet are going to have their headquarters somewhere roughly in the Best Grove. It's there where they're going to write Special Order number 191. This is not a battle plan. This is a troop directive that sort of splits the Confederate Army up into basically accomplish two objectives: to move a section of it to the Boonesboro area to kind of sit and hang out, because most importantly, the biggest wing, I guess it's kind of set up in like a two-wing situation here, the biggest wing of it, Jackson's guys, which are roughly about half the strength of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia at the time, right, a little more, they're sent to go neutralize the garrison at Harper's Ferry. Remember, there's about 12 to 14,000 Union soldiers that hadn't fallen back as Lee had expected when they crossed the river. They had stayed kind of put. In fact, they've been more or less reinforced by the guys from Martinsburg.
That's right.
So here we have this massive Confederate movement to go neutralize Harper's Ferry and section of it to sit and wait. In response to this, Union General George McClellan, who's got this newly reconstituted Army of the Potomac, remember, it's not just the AOP that had been down on the Virginia Peninsula. We have John Pope's Army of Virginia and the Washington Garrison. So think about things like the Iron Brigade and stuff like that. They had only been out in the field a real short time with the Army of Virginia because they've been in Washington doing things like building forts. So here we are now, right? McClellan's armies are pursuing. They're heading west, which brings us to where we are today. We're going to talk about the September 14th, 1862 fight, the Battle of South Mountain. We're just outside Burkittsville, Maryland. We're here at Crampton's Gap, Maryland State Park, and as you know, it's just north of Burkittsville. We're here to film in the daytime because in addition to all the Civil War history around us, we are obviously trying to stay away from the Blair Witch. No?
No.
Okay. It's a fictitious movie, guys. It came out in the early 2000s, and it's set right here in Burkittsville, so it's the only thing we get to reference on the Hollywood scale. However, it is a fictitious movie, and it was actually shot at another Maryland state park, not even anywhere close to here.
Completely different park.
Shot down at Seneca State Park, down in like the Gaithersburg, Maryland area. But not here for Blair Witches, even though that's a cool horror movie. Matt, we have three gaps that are the center of the focus here during the Battle of South Mountain. We have Turner's Gap, Crampton's Gap, and Fox's Gap. We chose Crampton's Gap just because it's a really cool place to film, things like that, but obviously you could have made a case to film at any of the other places. They have some good scenery there as well. But Lee has placed his troops here in these three gaps in kind of a defensive posture, and McClellan's got to figure out a way to dislodge them and try to gain an advantage. Matt, take it away. How do we sort of get into the positions we're at, and what are some of the first movements of the Battle of South Mountain?
Sure, Pat. Basically what's going to happen is that we do have the three main gaps. As Pat said, Turner's, Fox's, and Crampton's. We're also going to have Confederate forces in the area of Frosttown Gap, a little further north of Turner's Gap, and at the Brownsville Gap, south of us. In fact, Confederate forces believe that the Union effort here towards Crampton will actually be heading, that was a feint, and that the vast majority of Union forces are heading for the Brownsville Gap. Jeb Stuart is in charge of the defense down here. The rest of the Confederate defense along the spine of South Mountain is mostly under the command of Daniel Harvey Hill. Now, Hill's going to be reinforced later on in the battle by James Longstreet, but the opening moves of the fight are mostly his around Frosttown, Turner's, and Fox's gaps.
Right.
Now, when it comes to those early gaps, or I should say those upper gaps, we have Federal forces moving out of Middletown, Maryland, shortly after dawn. Federal cavalry under Pleasanton are going to move towards the gaps. They're going to quickly become engaged by Confederate forces near Turner's Gap along what was the National Road at the time, what is today Alternate 40. Those Federal troops, upon realizing the extent of the resistance at the gaps, is going to begin to call for aid. Now, the closest aid to them is going to be the Union 9th Corps. Now, the 9th Corps is going to move out of Middletown, Maryland, and it is going to begin to avoid Turner's Gap. They're not going after that gap initially. They're actually going to take a hard left at Bolivar. And Bolivar is a little tiny blink town along Route 40. It's easy to miss just outside of Middletown. They're going to turn there onto what was then known as the Old Sharpsburg Road. Pat, do you remember the name of the road today?
Is it Reno?
Reno Monument
It's
Road.
Reno Monument Road.
Yep, exactly right. And the reason for that is that, of course, Jesse Reno is commanding the 9th Corps and will sadly be cut down in the fighting at Fox's Gap.
That's right.
Now, the Fox's Gap's actually going to start this thing off when it comes to the fight at South Mountain. A little after 9 a.m. or about 9 a.m., his troops are maneuvering down the Old Sharpsburg Road into Fox's Gap. They're going to come under fire almost immediately as they're approaching the gap near the Weiss Field or Weiss Farm. They are going to actually move a little bit further to the south, trying to outflank yet another Confederate position. We're going to have famous regiments such as the 23rd Ohio Infantry, a regiment with 2 future presidents in it, Rutherford B. Hayes and William McKinley.
Rutherford B. Hayes does not have a great day on the Fox's Gap fight, just for the record.
Exactly right. He is going to be wounded, and he'll actually miss Antietam because of it. Yeah. But both Hayes and William McKinley will be at the fight at South Mountain at Fox's Gap.
McKinley has a pretty bad day a little bit later in the turn of the century at that
right.
point. So look that one up too.
Now, these Federal troops will eventually outflank the Confederate position and begin to drive them back from the area of the Weiss Farm. And we're going to have a deadly no man's land develop right in Fox's Gap, right at the highest point of the gap where the farm is, for a couple of hours as both sides pour in reinforcements. And some of the reinforcements that are coming onto the field for the Federal troops are actually going to be another Union Corps. Around noon, the Union 1st Corps, under the command of Joseph Hooker, is going to be moving out. And they're going to move out of Middletown, Maryland, and instead of taking that left at Boulevard, they're going to take a hard right at Boulevard.
It's like I went the other way because I don't know directions.
And they're going to move up towards first Frosttown Gap, and then as his troops become engaged there, they will send additional forces, including our beloved Iron Brigade,
That's right.
up the Old National Pike to Turner's Gap. So by the end of the day, all 3 of the northern gaps from where we're standing will be engaged. In fact, the fighting at Frosttown and Turner's is going to go into the nighttime. Some of the fighting around Frosttown Gap won't wrap up until well after dark. We have similar accounts of this occurring at Fox's Gap as well. The troops commenting that they're firing at the muzzle flashes of their opponents. We will have deadly blue on blue or friendly fire incidents occurring at many of these gaps, and even hand-to-hand combat. Something of a rarity in the American Civil War.
Yeah.
But we do have some deadly hand-to-hand combat going on.
Every Civil War movie that you've ever seen at some point shows a charge that breaks down, and they engage in a very violent tussle, hand-to-hand, bayonets, rifle clubbings, things like that. That happens in the war, absolutely. We're not by any means saying it doesn't, but the way that you're seeing it when Hollywood or whatever shows it to you, it's like it makes it a common thing. It's not, but here it is.
Yep.
And that's sort of one of the things that makes, you don't want to say makes a fight special, but makes it unique, is like you had one of these denigrations of things down to the most primitive base level. We are just beating and mashing each other with our hands. And that happens right here at South Mountain.
It certainly does. Now, where we're at Crampton's Gap, things are going to go a little differently, Pat, because we had fighting very early in the morning and throughout most of the day at those upper gaps we mentioned. But here, the Union 6th Corps had been ordered to move beyond South Mountain into the Pleasant Valley and attempt to relieve the Harper's Ferry garrison. They had been ordered to do that on the night of the 13th, being told to step off at dawn on the 14th. Now, they are going to reach Burkittsville by way of Jefferson a little after noon on September 14th.
Remember, daylight, no witches. It's much safer for the Union Army to move through Burkittsville.
Really? They will arrive at Burkittsville a little after noon. Now, what's going to happen at this point is very interesting because the 6th Corps will pause.
Right.
It's actually going to sit here for a little while. The initial Confederate defenders here at Crampton's Gap are very limited. There is a lot of confusion within the Confederate ranks as to where the Federals are going to go, because remember, they're still watching the Brownsville Gap a little further to the south of us. Jeb Stuart is convinced Federals are going to be heading that direction. However, the 6th Corps is actually waiting for additional troops. Come to find out, Darius Couch with the Union 4th Corps, which is only one division.
Darius and Couch.
Yes, Darius and Couch, depending on how you want to pronounce it. They're moving up behind the 6th Corps, and they have been told, the 6th Corps has actually been told not to wait for them. But they will wait at least an hour for the 4th Corps to come up, this one division, before finally getting their game in gear. They will bring up the rest of the 6th Corps over the course of this delay, and around 4 o'clock, they are going to finally deploy into long lines of battle just beyond us to the east here, facing Crampton's Gap. Now, we're going to see a fantastic infantry charge across the open fields below Crampton's Gap. We're also going to be seeing a little bit of street fighting, honestly.
Yep.
We have federal forces moving up through Burkittsville, driving back Confederate cavalry and also some Confederate infantry skirmishers through the street of Burkittsville. I say the street of Burkittsville because that's pretty much all it is.
Still, today, one street. No witches. All right, I'm done.
Thank you. Federal forces will hit this defensive line along the base of Crampton's Gap because the Confederates are not up here way up in the gap where they would not be able to really maneuver against any thrust. They're down near the base of South Mountain. Federal forces hit that line, they will break that line, and then they begin pursuing Confederate troops up the mountain. And in fact, looking off just to the east of us, this gap here at Crampton's is where federal forces are actually going to move right up through the opening in the mountain. There would be some Confederate reinforcements that are brought down very kind of late in the day. The Confederate troops realize that they are going through Crampton's Gap, not Brownsville Gap. Some reinforcements arrive here. Even a couple of guns become engaged right here in Crampton's Gap, and one of those cannon will actually be captured on the retreat. Federal forces gain Crampton's Gap at about dark. They would continue to pursue the Confederates down into the Pleasant Valley, and there they would bed down for the night. So at the end of the day, we've had three major and a couple of minor gaps fought over here at South Mountain. We have combined casualties of over 5,500 men for both sides, and federal forces have now put Lee on not only the defensive, but have thrown his troops out of the gaps and are now pursuing.
Yeah, he's on defense in unfamiliar territory right now, temporarily unsupported by this huge element of his army. Remember, Jackson's, doing the thing, and he's kind of late with the neutralization of Harper's Ferry. We'll get into that in the next installment of the Instagram exclusive. But you have Lee, who went from this moment of confidence across the river. He's got to kind of like peel off his original plan to keep going and take care of Harper's Ferry, and everything's starting to kind of crumble a little bit in a small way. He's got to, take his smaller portions and defend this gap. McClellan's going to get a foothold, drive the forces out of the gap. This is a Union victory.
Absolutely.
And in a war that here in the East hasn't featured a lot of Union victories, this is a pretty significant one because, remember, there is kind of one goal for McClellan, and that is get Lee out of Maryland. And right here is where Lee starts to have to think about what the next moves are, and some of them potentially are getting out of Maryland.
Yep.
So this is a very critical battlefield, even though in the shadow of Antietam, a lot of things kind of get overlooked, and this battle certainly does, but it is super critical in setting up what happens, because right now, like Matt said, Lee's on the defensive, and he's now, very, very, very impatiently waiting on Jackson's guys to deal with what they needed to and get to him. So there are riders and couriers probably streaming from the various command centers and riding to Jackson right now to say, hey, get your boys and get up to me here. We're going to be positioning ourselves. Is he telling them that we're sort of heading for the Antietam Creek at this point, or? Actually,
what he's telling his command is that it's time to go. Nothing has gone right here on the Maryland campaign for Lee. Federal forces have gained his
So it's
rear.
here he decides it's over.
Yes, it's after his troops are pushed off the gaps of South Mountain that Lee is going to dictate, because he's not capable of writing at the time, both of his arms are in splints, that he will dictate an order to his forces to fall back across the Potomac River into Virginia at Shepherdstown. What was still Virginia at the time is now West Virginia.
Right.
These troops are going to fall back from South Mountain on the 15th, On the morning of the 15th, they're in Sharpsburg, and it would be at that point that they receive a rider from Jackson saying that Harper's Ferry will fall that morning. Jackson's shooting for 8 a.m. And once Harper's Ferry falls, Jackson is promising to send his troops back to Lee.
Like immediately.
It would be at that point that Lee would decide to make his stand upon the Sharpsburg Ridge that would lead to America's bloodiest day.
So we will join you for the next field installment from Harper's Ferry battlefield, where we'll talk about what it is, in my opinion, perhaps Matt's, but Jackson's finest hour. Because remember, at Chancellorsville, he gets shot eventually. So nothing really negative happens for Jackson or Harper's Ferry, in my opinion. So Harper's Ferry and mine, like I said, is Jackson's finest moment. We're going to get into that, which is really cool. But I want to leave you just with a cool little bit of the history of the actual place where we're standing. Behind us is the War Correspondence Memorial. It was commissioned, I guess, funded by George Townsend, who was a local to the area here. He was a war correspondent during the war. He was good friends with a lot of kind of famous people, among them Mark Twain. During the American Civil War. But obviously, when you've served as a war correspondent, in a hostile environment, war environment, things like that, you maintain a camaraderie with your fellow writers out in the field. You're a non-combatant in a very dangerous place, and sometimes you are casualties of the war you are covering, not really outright participating in. And this is the War Correspondence Memorial that George Townsend had erected for all the correspondents of the American Civil War. And the property around it has kind of grown into a more all-encompassing of all the engagements, really, that we've kind of participated in. And it's become a sort of a de facto War Correspondence Memorial for the country in the area. So we have references to Daniel Pearl, who's a very modern, contemporary war correspondent who was killed in the line of his work, things like that. So if you ever make it to Crampton's Gap, take a moment and just have a few reflective thoughts for all the journalists who you don't often think about, that bring you the details of the wars that we get to study, the news that we all watch every day, and oftentimes they don't get to come home from their jobs. So what I like about this is a pretty unique memorial on a battlefield that you don't really see. Usually it's infantry, artillery, cavalry. This one's for the writers. This one's for the journalists. So Matt, I had a really good time. Thank you for sharing the Battle of South Mountain with us. Can't wait to get out in the field at Harper's Ferry. So until next time, guys, I'm Pat. This is Matt. This has been the History Things Podcast, Instagram video exclusive, Maryland Campaign 1862.
Have a good night.